Welcome to our Reconciling Conversation Sunday night session. We're glad that you're here tonight. Tonight is a special night because as part of that process of conversation and discerning, we have invited actually tonight 2 congregations who are going to come and share with us about their experience pre-becoming reconciling and maybe a little bit of post-becoming reconciling, so that we get to hear from their process, their experience, what they are encountering, and all of those things that I think can be very beneficial to all of us as we are discerning. We're in the midst of discerning. And so we'll take a moment to introduce our guest. But why don't we pray before we begin? Okay, let's pray. God, we thank you for tonight. We thank you for the opportunity we have to gather to talk and pray and learn about what it means to be your church today. We ask for your presence to be among us so that we might be able to hear each other, understand each other, and discern together what is it that you're calling us to be today. I'm thankful for Silver Spring UMC and for Chevy UMC for volunteering and giving of their time on a Sunday night, and for allowing us to learn from their wisdom and experience as they have taken the step that we're in the process of learning about. So bless our time together, and we're thankful to be here. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Before I introduce our guest, the idea is to be done in around an hour, just to have a time, to honor that time and to be together. So the way we're going to do it tonight is it's going to be a conversation with them. I'm going to ask them maybe just a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to all of you to ask your own questions about questions that you may have. Does that make sense? Okay. So I want to introduce you from Silver Spring UMC. It's Patsy Brandon, Patsy, and Wes Buchanan. Okay? Can we give a hand of appreciation for being here on a Sunday night? And then we have Jeff G. from Chevy UMC, who's also representing and who's going to share with us about their experience. Okay. So the first question that I want to ask you is about your process of the church where you are. When did you become reconciling? And so I'm going to move to this mic, and you guys going to come to this mic so you can speak here. So introduce yourself, and then.
So I'm Patsy Brannon. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. I've been a member of Silver Spring United Methodist Church for about 1.5 years, having attended it about 3 years ago when I was on sabbatical. The church was reconciling, I think it's within the past 5 or 6 years. The process, the exact date, I'm not quite so sure about. Before that, we were members at St. Paul's United Methodist Church, and they're celebrating their 20th anniversary of being reconciling. I know a bit about the process in each one, but I have to tell you, both congregations had done their process before we joined, and in fact, for both churches, the fact that they were reconciling is one of the major reasons why we were attracted to explore membership in each of the congregations. I think both processes involved lay-led reconciling teams. The process at St. Paul's, I think, was 3 years, and involved it's much of what was modeled in the material that I sent you, building relationships, graceful engagement to listen with open minds, public storytelling to touch hearts, education. And one of the interesting things about St. Paul's, and I'll let you speak to Silver Spring, one of the interesting things about St. Paul's is early on, because 20 years ago when they made this decision, it was about 23 years ago when they started the process, and it was started by 3 lay members independently who for reasons in their own families and personal lives felt driven to build inclusivity. But the decision was made not to address transgendered. So it was focused, the reconciling statement was focused strictly on sexual orientation. And at the 10th year anniversary, we had an outside speaker in the worship service, and that person challenged us deeply and meaningfully to take on what she called the T word. And we were a part of that part, the second phase, if you will, of reconciling, in which we looked at adding transgender to our reconciling statement. And that process looked much the same. There was an educational session, there were public storytellings, there was discernment and consideration, and I think was an easier process in some ways because we already were a reconciling congregation. The process and the vote at Silver Spring, at St. Paul's, was overwhelmingly positive. I think it was like 97%, but it was not unanimous. And that was one of the issues that the congregation had to deal with as it went forward. So I think that's enough about that process.
That's perfect, yes. Would you like to say anything, West?
Good evening. I don't usually speak in public. I try to avoid it like the plague. And this makes it... Thank you. I'm going to need that. Because for me, going to Silver Spring United Methodist Church is a very emotional situation. You heard John Wesley's story about having his heart warmed. I had the similar experience. But it started out slowly. You know, we passed the peace every Sunday. Now, we've done that at St. Paul's, and we've done it at other churches. I've been a Methodist all my life. But there was a difference. There was such joy in the congregation at 9:30 in the morning. These people were alive. They're glad to be here. They're glad to see their fellow congregants. This meant something to them. This was important to be there. They accepted everyone. We had a welcoming community. It meant a lot to me. Enough so that we live a considerable distance from the church, but there's no question in my mind where I wanted to go back. The welcoming nature, I think, provides a very open and inclusive environment. So there's an awful lot of sharing. There's an awful lot of caring that I didn't see in other churches. And I certainly didn't feel it. When you talk to other people from Silver Spring, you'll find them telling the same story. So you end up with a place where people want to be there. They want to invite their friends there. People know that this is a good and safe place to be. Thank you.
Thank you, West.
Good evening. My name is Jeff. As we said, I'm from Chevy Chase United Methodist Church. I actually grew up outside of Chicago in Elmhurst, Illinois, and I was raised in the First United Methodist Church in Elmhurst, Illinois. And I just quickly texted my mother while I was sitting over here. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Some churches like coffee in the sanctuary, some allow texting. I never know what the rules are. And I asked her, when did First United Methodist become reconciling? Because it did, and she quickly shot back and said it was 2012 for them. And I mention this because I tried to explain to my mother what reconciling was when we started the process, and she said, "Oh, we did that 3 years ago." And, you know, as if, of course we had, because their process at their church was apparently not at all controversial. Everyone sort of was very quickly on the same page and moved forward with it, and then moved on with it very, very easily. Chevy Chase had a very different process than that. Our reconciling process took over 6 years, and it was 6 years of sort of very stop and go. The conversation would begin, the conversation would sort of get to a certain point, and we had actually reached a point where a vote was being discussed and even sort of calendared, and the sense is that there was a clear majority for reconciling, and that's why we didn't do it, because at that time, because it was a clear majority as opposed to a broad consensus, and there was a lot of concern about moving forward at that point. That was about 2-3 years into the process. So we allowed the process to sort of pause for a moment. Perhaps not coincidentally, around the same time one of our worship leaders, Henry, came out as transgendered and announced that he would be transitioning in the near future, which became a centerpiece of the conversation around inclusiveness and diversity. It was no longer a hypothetical for our church. We had to have a lot of conversations, and it was not quick and easy. This was not a moment, this wasn't a Hallmark movie where someone said this thing and then suddenly everyone was on the same page. People were very much not on the same page. There were people with some very strong opinions in one direction and strong opinions in another, and it took a while to work through that. And as we did work through that and we came out the other side, Susan, as she became known, remained one of our worship leaders for 2 years after her transition, and left for totally unrelated reasons later. And as we sort of regrouped from that, we decided to move forward with a welcoming statement. We took some time to work on a welcoming statement, and once that was done, the conversation around reconciling sort of re-engaged in earnest, and we went through a process that I think is similar to most churches, of a series of meetings focused on sort of education primarily, and then another series of meetings focused on dialogue primarily. And when we ultimately did move towards a vote, the vote was, I think, something slightly over 92% in favor. Once again, that meant 8% opposed, and that was something we had to reckon with, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that. One of the things I want to circle back to, though, in the middle of the process, I think as part of Susan's transitioning, and part of the conversations that we had around there, our youth group sort of woke up to the fact that the Book of Discipline had the language that we are all familiar with at this point. It was something that they hadn't really focused on before, and quite frankly, they were outraged at it. And I think one of the main things that led us into our final phase of reconciling, the real momentum that drove us to not just continue a dialogue, but bring a dialogue to a conclusion, was the fact that our youth group became really a leading force in it. And they put together an open letter to the congregation that they read out during our services, effectively demanding that we move forward with the process. And I think that made a lot of difference to a lot of folks. A lot of people felt very free to talk about the youth, and it was a very different thing to hear from the youth. And I think that made a very big difference in our process. But I'm happy to answer questions on any of that.
So I'm gonna start with you, and then just to be thinking about the question, and certainly because you are in different, you came at different points to the congregation. But the question that I want to ask is, why was it important for you, your congregation, to become reconciling?
I think that it was a conversation that, as I said, began and continued over a long period of time. And I think that, not to invoke what's going on with the larger denomination at this point, but I think we got to a point where we couldn't not finish the conversation one way or another. That, particularly with the transitioning of our worship leader and the engagement of our youth group, it was important that I sort of really come to terms with where we as a congregation stood on the issue. And it as many such conversations, it was at times painful, and it did, I'll be very blunt, it did lead to a couple of people leaving the church at the end, which I still regret. They were people that I cared for, and I wish we had found a way for that not to happen. But ultimately, that's what they felt they were required to do. Notwithstanding that, I think the entire church, including those people that left, felt that we could no longer kick the can down the road, that we had had enough conversations, and that we had to resolve the process.
At St. Paul's, I think it was important to the congregation in terms of how we saw ourselves as Christians and what we thought Christ called us to be. I often describe it this way, which is that we didn't want to be in a position of trying to decide which part of the body of Christ we wouldn't accept. We wanted to accept all of Christ's body and all of God's children. And I think that was very deeply driven by faith and by the theology of the congregation. At St. Paul's, that's certainly what I perceive as part of it. But at St. Paul's, there's also a very strong intersectionality of inclusiveness. And so we have a very strong racial justice group. We have a very strong Beyond Reconciling group. We have a strong outreach mission to individuals who are in need. And many of those things are true, but at Silver Spring, they intersect in a way such that the faith is really deepened by the drive for social and faith justice.
So this might be my last question so that I can give room for the congregation to ask. So I want to ask you about your process. All of you have mentioned a process. I don't want to get into all the details of the process, but can you talk about the philosophy of your process to engage and to, how was that discerned? Again, we had this meeting on Tuesday and then 2 months, I don't want those details. I just want to know what was important for you as you were doing the process to make sure that it took place. Does that make sense? Okay, all right.
We're just muttering amongst ourselves. Since I actually went through the process, I'll start. So the process was, part of the process was talking about the process itself. And that was good and bad. I mean, one of the things that we had to focus on was the process needed to be inclusive in and of itself. It needed to be transparent. It needed to be open-minded. It didn't, we did not want it to seem like we were making any token efforts in any direction, that every effort we made to folks across the spectrum of views needed to be heartfelt in order for the process to feel right and legitimate for folks. I think that what we discovered was, and again, I want to go into detail about, we had this movie night and we had this discussion and we had a candidate for clergy come in and speak about their journey, someone who was turned down as a result of being homosexual. We had people from conservative theological backgrounds come in and talk about their point of view. And, all of that was very important. What we discovered, though, was we needed to do more than just have good programs and have good ideas flying back and forth. One of the really critical things that we almost discovered too late was the importance of outreach, because the people who continued to show up for all of these wonderful programs were the same 6 people. Oh, that sounds familiar to anybody? Just in general, in a church, that it's the same 6 people doing the bake sale and the rummage sale and the bazaar, and And those 6 people were wonderfully educated on all sides of the issues by the end, but those weren't the 6 people that we really needed to hear from, and those weren't the voices that we needed in the conversation. We needed everyone's voices, and we really changed our focus near the end to doing really one-on-one outreach, to the point where I was on the Reconciling Committee, and we took the directory practically and assigned out people to each member to say, you are going to call these 6 people and see if you can have coffee with them and see if you can, talk to them about what their concerns are. It wasn't a proselytizing, it wasn't a conversion process, it was specifically what can we hear from these people, and what will we need to get them in the room to have the discussion. And for some folks, that was really useful and positive. Others managed to avoid our engagement, no matter how hard we tried. But at the end of the process, we felt like we had done what we could do to make the process as welcoming and as open as we could. Does that help?
Comment that much the same approach was taken in both congregations that we're now in. We're also trained as process coaches, and the notion of one-on-one visits is strongly advocated in the Building an Inclusive Church Toolkit, and for many of the reasons that Jeff talked about, and part of it is this notion of graceful engagement. And that we have these conversations within the grace, within the family, recognizing that we may not all agree. And I think it's really important, and I wanted to talk to this from what happened at St. Paul's and what we experienced post-reconciling. And that was that the conversations had been important, the education had been important, the public storytelling of experience had help develop empathy and an understanding of what this meant to people and why it was important. What the conversations hadn't delved into is what it would be like once welcoming happened. And we experienced at the 10th anniversary, the 10th anniversary team was all individuals who were homosexual. And we looked at that and said to ourselves, what's with this picture? And so we joined the team. And we got asked over and over and over again, very politely, this very blunt question is, what are you as heterosexuals doing here to help us celebrate this? And we answered that it's important to us. It's very important to us. And what had not happened in that conversation was to have the kind of sharing beyond and engaging, as Jeff said, all perspectives. And I think it's really an important thing to happen. And we had one person say to us, well, I was willing to do this and I got why it was important, but do we have to celebrate every year? Why do we do this? And that 10th year, we had a woman who had been in seminary, had been refused ordination because she was a lesbian, come and talk to us. And she was very inspiring. And there was not a dry eye in the room when she said, and this was 10 years ago, at 11 o'clock in Chicago, there is no place that I am welcome to worship. And the person who had said to us most often, why do we have to celebrate? She made a beeline for me the next Sunday and said, I get it. I get why it's important. And so I think as these conversations occur, making space for differences of opinion, finding ways to engage gracefully when to me, part of the Wesley theology, and I guess you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that we don't have to all agree on everything. But we have to agree to be together in our differences. And I think that's a very hard thing to do, and successful reconciling processes create the space for the congregation to do that.
Patsy, stay there. I'm going to follow up and then we'll go back. So I said that was my last. This is the last question, and then I'm going to promise. So, because you kind of touched on it, and Jeff, you did it too. So, when you mentioned that how that experience of hearing that pastor sharing, and she's the person, oh, now I got it. Mm-hmm. So sometimes the conversation in congregations, and again, our context is similar and in some ways very different. You know, every congregation is different, but when people say, well, we're already welcoming, why do we have to make a statement? Why do we have to take on a name or join an organization? We're already very loving, very inclusive. Why do we have to do that? Like, tell me how that was processed for you in your context.
For me, there are many things that come to mind, but I'm going to tell you a story. Our church became very involved in the reconciling process in the district in upstate New York. And we had a program, and a woman came. She was the only person that came from her congregation. We happened to sit with her at lunch. And I just happened to say to her, what interested you in this? And she looked at me and she said, my congregation's very loving. They're very accepting of me. They don't know my granddaughter is gay. And I can't tell anybody because it's not safe. And I would say to you, the value of an open, welcoming statement and standing as a reconciling congregation is you send an absolutely unambiguous statement that it's safe. And to me, that's Christian.
I think there's probably any number of examples like that one. I'll talk about the abstract first, and then have a specific one. I think the reason that it's important, and this is exactly the conversation we got hung up on for quite a while, because there were a number of people who were opposed to the reconciling process who basically said, we already say everyone's welcome. Everyone means everyone. Why do we have to say anything more than that? We just say people are welcome, gay people are people, therefore they are welcome. And we don't need to say anything more. Stop pushing. We don't need it because it's already there. Everybody means everybody. And my response throughout that process is that, as long as the United Methodist Church as a whole has language in its book of discipline that is specifically and uniquely specifically disaffirming, we need to be equally specific to affirm. And that is the problem with saying all, is that it's an all with an asterisk over it right now. And even if the book of discipline language is removed, the problem is that people who are gay, who are lesbian, who are transgendered, who are non-binary, they hear from the Christian church universal writ large that they are inherently sinful, inherently wrong. There are parts of the world where, as we see in recent days, that it is not merely illegal to be gay, but they are working to change the law to make it punishable by death to be gay. That there are places where that is true right now, and there are places that is being worked on right now. And those efforts are being led by the church. And so all are welcome is not good enough when you have other people who are loudly proclaiming their Christian bona fides, who say that their Christian faith demands not only the exclusion of people who are gay, but their death. The least we can do is have a welcoming statement that is specific enough to let people who are gay, who are transgendered, who are bisexual know that no, we don't have a coded we in this place. We don't have a coded all in this place. We actually mean you, not just a generic all, that it's you specifically. So that's the generic. Some of the specific ones are that, we we recently, after the last General Conference and before the last Pride, we put up some new banners on Chevy Chase United Methodist. You drive south on Connecticut Avenue into the district. We're across the street from the 4-H Center, just as you pass the Beltway and just before you hit the district line. And you'll see they're still up. They're rainbow banners that say, "All are welcome." And as I was joining my son and Pastor Kirkland and Brad, who was our youth director at the time, the four of us were wildly incompetently putting these things up because we thought we knew how it worked and we were wrong. But as we were doing it, a jogger was jogging by and literally stopped in his tracks and waited for us to get to a point where we were not almost killing ourselves, and asked us about it and asked us what was going on. And he said, my parents went here. He was a moderately older guy, about my age, mid-40s. He said, my parents went here. I had no idea that you were welcoming because, frankly, my parents went here and I wouldn't have thought it. I wouldn't have thought that, gay people were welcome here. And I'm gay, and it never occurred to me to come back here. Never occurred to him to come back to the church where his parents went. That's why we have to be specific.
It's easy to put up a statement, put up a flag, a banner, but you have to really mean it. People will discern very quickly whether you mean it or not, and it's not easy. One of our celebrations at St. Paul's, we got to know Jamie, who was transsexual. And as we got to know her, we tried to include her more, but she wasn't comfortable. We found an opportunity for her to participate, because we always had people welcome people who attend the church at the front doors. And Patsy made a call. Would you like to do this? That was the start of about 3 phone calls with Patsy and Jamie, probably an hour and a half worth of conversation, ending with Jamie saying, I don't believe it. I'm very worried. I don't know that it's safe. I've experienced discrimination before, and it's ugly. Finally, we got the minister, who, after about half an hour, got her convinced. This is what you're dealing with when you're trying to make it open and welcoming, when you have a history of not being open and welcoming. When you have people who can't get married in the church. In other words, they're sort of members, but not really. Their tithe is important. We'll take all of that, thank you. We won't give you a membership card. We won't let you get married. And there are other things that we'll do to make you feel distinctly uncomfortable. If you want a church that's going to be all, you have to have it safe. People have to know, and they will know it by when they walk in. How are they accepted? People shake their hands. Are they glad to see them? Does it matter? And you'll find out very quickly. You don't know who's who, and you don't really care. We're all here. It's Sunday morning. It is imperative that we create that safe space, that we get rid of the language that is so ugly and keeps people from wanting to attend. I like the way Jeff's done it. It's the way I've seen successful efforts done before, and it's for why.
Okay. Questions? Okay. Pat and then Jean.
I'm interested that, yes, we think we want to be a reconciling congregation. But what happens when 2 of your congregation come to you and say, we're gay and we do want to get married in the church? What happens?
I've been in two congregations that have taken very different approaches. And the contexts are different. The bishops were different. The ministers were different. And so it's a tension. St. Paul's, much to the dismay of a number of us, wouldn't take on the marriage equality issue, as we called it, for a couple of reasons. Our minister said he'd taken a vow. The bishop was not prophetic. It was very uncomfortable. And then we had an associate bishop who was United Church of Christ, could have, and then we learned that the district actually had the deed to our building in trust, and we could not use the building either. So there was a lot of conversation around that, and still ongoing, and I think that's one of the things about the post-reconciling process that you have to think about. As process coaches, we're encouraged to have in the reconciling process some conversation around that. Silver Spring, marriage equality, we've had same-sex marriages, we'll have more. In fact, we have marriages coming up in February that are important to us. And so I think different congregations come to different places with their comfort level. And while there's a part of me that's that wild 60s advocate piece that would like to see us all do the same thing and has this driven idea of what that might be, I think graceful engagement is such that we need to be open to the fact that we have to find something where there is consensus and what that consensus looks like. And I do think, I shared two examples of congregations that made very different decisions.
The only thing I'll add to that, because I only represent one church here, so I can't talk about what multiple churches have done. I will say that one of the things that we haven't faced the problem yet. I think it would be a wonderful problem to have, but we have not been. That to my knowledge, it hasn't been put in front of us yet. I am aware, however, that there are at least two dimensions to that. There is the getting married inside the building, and then there is the pastor who marries. And the building part is something that the lay leadership would have to engage on, and our church council would have to engage on. The pastor is something that only the clergy in question can engage on. And as you all know at this point, it can be the consequences can be absolute, and we're in a little bit of a twilight phase between the last general conference and when some of these things come fully into effect. But once, when and if the rulings of the last general conference do come into effect, those consequences could be even more severe and even more immediate. And that is not something that I'm not sure that a congregation. I'll leave it to other congregations. I'm not sure our congregation would feel good about demanding a pastor make that decision on the basis of our vote. That's something that an individual pastor would need to take onto their own conscience.
So St. Matthew's has already taken the step of writing a very inclusive welcoming statement. So we have it. So the point that we're at now is that we are trying to figure out how to take our congregation through becoming part of the reconciling ministry, getting our name on. Okay, so that's where we are slowed down now. And you see, just look around, okay? There are a lot more people in this church. And now we want to make sure that everybody is aware of what's going on. That, I think, is why most of us are here. I don't know if you saw our welcoming statements on the front of our bulletin. Would you agree it's very inclusive? Okay, so how do we get more people engaged? That's my question.
Sure, and that is exactly where we stalled out at a certain point. We had a drafting committee that was for the welcoming statement. It was myself and two other people. We were very deliberate in the choices of the people. As I probably should have tipped my hand a little bit to acknowledge my biases. I was very in favor of the reconciling process. What a surprise. But we tried to make sure that there was someone with a different point of view that was on the drafting committee, and then a third person to sort of balance the two of us out. And we got our welcoming statement, and then we sort of stalled out as people said, "Okay, we've got a welcoming statement. We don't need to do anything else." And so, yes, for us, that was a place where we plateaued for a little while. And that's where, as I said, the one-on-one efforts came out of that period, because we discovered that even if we were having meetings, the same 6, the same 12, the same 8 people were showing up at them, and they weren't the people that necessarily we needed in the room. We were happy to have everybody in the room, but we needed other people to be in that room. And so what I think broke through for us was the one-on-one connections. And it's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of effort, and it can be a little more than a little uncomfortable. That's the thing. This process takes you to uncomfortable places. I think that we were all better for it, just in terms of the people who were in those one-on-one conversations at least had those moments of connection that were valuable in and of themselves, even if it didn't change anything for anybody on the topic at hand. At least they had that moment of engagement. So other than continuing the process, continuing to have meetings, the only sort of thing beyond that I can suggest is the one-on-one connection stuff.
I think the other thing that's useful is to think about, if you haven't done it already, you've had educational meetings, but to have public storytellings, personal stories of experiences, because I've seen that touch people's hearts in a way that the factual information just doesn't.
Let me ask a question which has been troubling me about this process, because we're clearly a very inclusive congregation. We affirmed that over a decade ago, and as just pointed out, we've written also a very inclusive statement just recently and affirmed that by a substantial margin here in the congregation. How has your churches dealt with the fact that you've moved to the next stage, in the sense you become affiliated with the Reconciling movement, in terms of the fact that decision by a local church doesn't automatically change the policies of the larger church, in that it doesn't automatically allow a local church to engage in LGBTQ marriages or affirm new clergy with that background, because those are decisions of the larger church as opposed to the local church. So how has your church responded to the divisions that are occurring within the larger church, and how this decision on behalf of a small number of churches seems to exacerbate the future of the church and lead to even further divisions within it? And that is the nature of the conversation that seems to lie just ahead of us. Not merely a decision of a local congregation like the one we're facing, but the decision of the larger church to divide over this issue, and ultimately have implications, I think, for what the consequences would be for all of us.
Let me say that I completely agree that becoming reconciling does not automatically change anything. As a matter of fact, I'll go a step farther. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't. Becoming a reconciling community does not change one comma of the Book of Discipline. It just doesn't. That's not how it works. It does not change any of the Book of Discipline measures about the discipline that the church can and potentially will take against pastors that perform same-sex marriages. That's not what it's intended to do. And I can't speak to every reconciling community. I can speak to ours. We felt it was important to join the Reconciling Ministries Network and not merely stop at having a welcoming statement, because we wish to publicly align ourselves with the point of view that is represented by the Reconciling Ministries Network. To stand up and be public in being affirming in as many ways as possible is what we feel called to do, and what we feel is the most inclusive. I'm trying to find words that are inclusive that isn't inclusive, because you say a word often enough and it stops meaning anything. And I'm going to retreat back to another anecdote. After becoming Reconciling, we joined several other capital area churches in walking in the D.C. Pride Parade. And I just remember someone very loudly, as I was carrying the sign that said Chevy Chase United Methodist Church, someone said, "Chevy Chase?" They were just... They clearly knew who exactly we were, and they were shocked that something, I mean, again, if you've driven south on Connecticut Avenue, you see our giant stone edifice. We're very institutional. We are very, imposing in our presentation on Connecticut Avenue. And it has felt important to us to stand up and be counted, to publicly declare that we feel that God's grace is for everyone, and not everyone with an asterisk over it. Specifically those people who have been specifically excluded. Will becoming a reconciling, if we get enough reconciling churches, do we automatically overturn the language of the Book of Discipline? Absolutely not. That's not how that works. If there are more reconciling churches, do we make it okay for some kid who is not in a reconciling church, somewhere in a conference that is deeply conservative, do we send the message to him that there are Christians, that there are United Methodists who feel that he is fundamentally of sacred worth? Then I think yes. I think that being in a public space, declaring what we stand for matters. And it matters whether or not it changes anything in a book of discipline. That's how we felt about it.
I agree with Jeff. I think your question is an important one, because your question says, does it matter what happens beyond our own church? And I think the answer to that is yes, for many of the same reasons Jeff gave you. I don't know if you ever sing the hymn by Mark Miller, "I'm a Child of God." But the words go, no matter what people say or think about me, I am a child of God. And I think affiliating with the Reconciling Ministry Network sends that message in the way that Jeff described. There are a couple of other things that we've experienced. I don't know how many of you are individual members of the Reconciling Ministry Network? Aha, great. You can become an individual member. I think one of the advantages, it plugs you in to great, accurate information. The leadership of the Reconciling Ministry Network is taking some heat from differences of opinion within the reconciling community, because they are standing firm that their position is to resist and change the United Methodist Global Church, not to break it, even if it appears broken to us. And I think that the other thing that becoming a reconciling congregation does is help you impact in a way that an individual congregation can't. And the Reconciling Ministry Network, we've been to, if you ever get a chance to go to a Reconciling Ministry convocation, they're every 2 years, and every 4 years they meet with MFSA, and it is the most amazing and inspiring worship experience that I've ever encountered. And it is about spreading the joy of accepting and loving all without the asterisk. And I think that's something that becoming reconciling can do in addition to giving that sort of public affirmation that Jeff described, and I think it's important.
I have a question for you, because you've been with St. Paul's for the 20 years that they've been reconciling. Did you have a clergy change? Because appointments, I'm not in the process, but appointments apparently are kind of done to you. So did you have a clergy change, and did that impact
Yes,
the congregation deciding to be reconciling?
St. Paul's had 3 clergy. The same clergy person was in place, the same lead pastor, during the reconciling process. When she went to another congregation, that congregation, independent of her, had already started the reconciling process, so she's a strong advocate, and I think that helps. I know of reconciling processes that are occurring in churches where the lead pastor is not supportive, and the conversations are still going on and are important, and at least one is likely to become a reconciling congregation without it. You raise an interesting issue, because at St. Paul's, when the minister appointment changed, the Staff Parish Relations Committee, you all probably know this, put together a description of your congregation, and front and center in St. Paul's and front and center at Silver Spring, because they've undergone a pastoral change in the last 3 years since they became reconciling, is that they are a reconciling congregation. And we describe it this way, that the pastor has to prophetically and boldly speak and model. And that's who we are. And for the district to assign us someone who would be opposed to that would be a really difficult set of circumstances. And I know that the Staff Parish Relations Committee at St. Paul's, both times we had 2 pastoral changes. It was very important for the Staff Parish Relations Committee to explore the level of support. And in all 3 cases, all the pastors were very supportive of being reconciling and supportive of being inclusive. And think about it this way, I can't imagine a pastor that would be opposed to this that would be very comfortable in a reconciling congregation. Well, I suppose theoretically they could. One of the interesting things that I've learned through the Reconciling Ministry Network is that the reconciling congregations are not a huge percentage. I think we're coming up on 10% now of the churches. It used to be 6%. But of the reconciling congregations, a far larger proportion pay their full apportionment than non-reconciling congregations. And this is known by the bishops. And so there are lots of ways in which these dynamics play out in the secular part of the organization as well.
Hi there. To all 3 of you, I would ask this question. We've gone through many, many classes now on what reconciling means and the history of the Methodist Church, everything else. But I think what you're saying, too, is that all of this needs to be brought forth to the entire congregation, that we need to take the time to go to all the members of the congregation to discuss this before it's ever even voted on, because it will affect everyone. Am I reading that right?
That's a yes?
We've heard the advantages of being a reconciling congregation. What are the downsides, if any?
So we found out about St. Paul's when we first moved to Ithaca because we bought a house of a couple that left the church because of the decision to be reconciling. And they had us over for New Year's dinner. They celebrated their last. We celebrated our first in the house, and they were busily telling us they were still quite angry about it. And we listened, and when we got in the car, we looked at each other and said, "Oh, we found a church." So what I would say to you is the Spirit works in amazing ways. And you heard Jeff say he still regrets the people who left. There are some congregations where people don't leave, that the process is done in a way that consensus is such that people feel understood and still feel welcomed even if they don't agree. In the circumstances when people leave, the other thing that happens is people come because it's reconciling. And in fact, we've had a number of new members since General Conference at Silver Spring. I think we're up about 20 new members. They all have come because we're reconciling. So becoming reconciling if that's the decision the congregation decides to make, is a statement by the congregation of who they are and who they want to be. And I think that has its power. But there could be some effects. But they're not unidirectional, I think is what I'm trying to say.
I think the first thing is exactly what we alluded to. We lost some members, and they were longtime members. There were people who were deeply involved with Sunday school, deeply involved with UMW, people who were deeply involved with various aspects of the church, and that was really unfortunate. And I still sort of 2 years later, I'm racking my brain to see how we could have done things differently, how we could have reached out to those people better. I still don't know. I don't know how we could have. I don't know specifically what we would have, could have, should have done to stop that. And I had personal conversations with some of the people who left, and personally invited them not to leave, to stay, and they actually didn't answer me. None of them actually did. None of them said, "Jeff, no, I'm leaving." They just kind of ended the conversation, and then I didn't see them in worship again. So that was not that. I would count that as the single worst thing. That is a downside. We also have had people join our church, specifically citing the fact that we are reconciling as a reason for them coming. I will say that what we probably have to acknowledge is that there might be people who are not coming to our church, who are seeing the rainbow banners up front and saying, "Nope, not for me." We'll never know how many of those there are, but I think we have to acknowledge that, potentially there are some, and that's sad as well, because we do try and mean it. Chevy Chase, I would not argue that we are the most diverse congregation in terms of a lot of dimensions, but there is political diversity, and we are not uniformly capital D Democrats. We're not uniformly R Republicans. We do, we focus on, Christ's message, not any politician's message, every Sunday morning. So the other thing that I would say is a downside is for some folks the sense that it's a finish line, that we've voted, we're reconciling, solved. We have solved discrimination. Go us. And that is clearly not true. And there is a sense that we have done what needs to be done and we're done. And that is something that we have had to, we are modestly still recent in our reconciling status. And so we're still on this journey to find out what being reconciling means. Because it's possible that that's all it means. All it is that you put your welcoming statement, you send in your high-resolution photo to the Reconciling Network, you write your check, and for some congregations, I think that may be all it is. And then they're done, and then they move on to the next thing. And that's not the wrong way to be reconciling necessarily. I don't think there is a wrong way, but if I have to say that there's a downside, the temptation is the one downside is there's a temptation to say we did a thing, now we don't have to do any more things, and personally, I don't feel that's true. I feel that there is always more work to be done, and I don't want us to become complacent just because we made a big gesture. But that's what I would think.
Okay, one last question. We don't need to have one if we don't need one, but can we give a hand of appreciation for sharing the time? Thank you, thank you. As you, in connection to everything that you have said, you got an email telling you that we put a pause on the Monday and Tuesday conversation, precisely for what you are saying. I think we detected those issues of conversation, and to be more the outreach part, I think we got it. And so we're gonna regroup with the Reconciling Task Force, and then we're gonna also begin to talk to the council, about questions about process. But I think all of that is not just, I think one of you said, it's not, or maybe you told me, Jeff, before, there's not ever going to be a perfect process where all of us are going to be 100% happy. There's always going to be a point where, well, why did we do it on Monday nights? We should have done it at 7 p.m. instead of 6:55, or we should have done it on Friday nights, or, there are there's never a process, but we do want to make sure that we make it the right way, and we pause, we pray, but we keep advancing. But so that's what's going to happen right now. We are not stopping. We're like pushing the pausing, and then we're going to regroup, and then inform to all of you, communicate with all of you, pray with all of you, and figure out how we can continue moving in our understanding of what it means to love all people. I think that that's the bottom line, right? Regardless of how we feel about things, I think that even if we don't like each other, we don't want to kill each other. We want to move to a place where, we're loving each other more. And it is, there's anxiety at all levels because of General Conference, because of all those things. But I think that as much as we don't have control over that, St. Matthew's continues to be St. Matthew's. And that love that we have will continue to be expressed. So that we can control. That we can work on. The rest is not up to us. Well, thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for coming and taking the time. Thank you for taking the time on a Sunday night. And we will be in touch with all of you. Keep the congregation in your prayers. Keep everyone who's part of this. And you too, as part of this, let's keep praying and let's figure this out together. Okay? Thank you for coming, and have a good night.